Hello everyone, and welcome to Ethical Thinking and Practice for Family Education Professionals. This is the first webinar presented by the National Council on Family Relations, along with their Minnesota affiliate. We welcome your attendance at this time and your participation both today and in the future on this topic. In a 90-minute format, this is an introduction to ethical practices for professionals. At the end of our webinar, there will be a contact information on how you can extend your learning through full-day, face-to-face workshops. Our time together will be spent on the 5-step collegial approach to case study analysis for ethical dilemmas, which was developed by the Ethics Committee of the Minnesota Council on Family Relations, an affiliate of the National Council on Family Relations. My name is Beth Gausman, and I will be serving as moderator of today's webinar, along with two presenters, Mary Maher and Bill Allen. My background is in early childhood education and parent education. I am currently a parent educator with a Minnesota School District Early Childhood Family Education Program, and I am an instructor with Concordia University St. Paul in their parent coaching program and their Family Life Education Master's Degree program. Bill?
Sure. My name is Bill Allen. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm in private practice at Healing Bonds, which is in uptown Minneapolis. In addition to my clinical work, I also teach at the University of Minnesota and at the University of St. Thomas, where I teach courses on the Introduction to Family Dynamics, and currently the practicum in marriage and family therapy at the University of St. Thomas. But I also do research into the intersection of ethnicity and multicultural issues in family process, as well as consult to the state and to counties on issues having to do with child welfare and the roles that males play in family life across the lifespan.
Mary?
Well, hello from Minnesota. This favorite part of Minnesota of mine is actually a babbling stream right now with trees starting to turn color, so I don't want to upset anyone and think you missed a season. I've had experience teaching parents in hospitals, school districts, and in private agency settings. I've taught over the phone, on home visits, in outreach playgroups, and in the classroom, mostly in early childhood family education programs and in Even Start family literacy programs. I also taught the Parent Education Practicum course at the University of Minnesota for a few years. I have been looking forward to working with Bill and Beth and bringing this material to you today in this new format.
Links to today's materials were sent to you in a webinar packet. You should see one titled Ethical Principles for Parent and Family Life Educators, and another titled Case Study Analysis Process Steps. In addition to the handouts, you should have ready access to an Ethical Thinking and Practice booklet, published either by MCFR or NCFR. Note there is a slight title difference between the two organizations. However, either booklet will contain the necessary information for today's dialogue. The MCFR booklet is available as a free download at the address on your screen. Our goals today are fourfold. First, you will hear how a variety of ethical viewpoints influenced MCFR's work on a set of principles for family education professionals. Second, you will be introduced to the principles found in the webinar handouts. These principles are also printed in both the NCFR and the MCFR booklets. Page 7, MCFR, page 14, NCFR. It is suggested that you keep those handy for your future reference. Third, a collegial approach using case studies helps not only to apply the principles of our work as parent and family life educators, but it also helps to define the difference between situations with ethical implications and true ethical dilemmas. And our fourth goal is to recognize some of the professional challenges that can arise within the use of the framework. We welcome your questions as we proceed through the webinar. I will record your questions as they come in, and we'll read them to Mary and Bill at the end of our presentation when time has been allowed. To submit a question, compose your text in the question box found on your webinar screen. We have a great variety of participants with us today in this webinar. Over 280 registered, and among you are persons from the United States, from Canada, from Korea, and from Taiwan. We welcome all of you. Settings represented include college and universities, extension, public health and nursing, early childhood, early Head Start, family support and family services, faith communities, court systems, youth services, family support, and parent education. A wonderful diversity with us today. And now here's Mary.
Good morning again. I want to start off with what we start off with in our face-to-face workshops, which are a few questions. What brings us here today? Why is it important to think and talk about ethics? We're all good people, right? We intend to do the right thing. Well, ethics requires an awareness and a responsibility to go beyond our good intentions. Parent and family educators face challenges in their work which require attention to ethical standards, thinking, and practices. For example, our work brings us in contact with families from multiple cultures, multiple backgrounds, multiple belief systems. And when we ring the doorbell on home visits, we're not always sure who's going to answer the door, any more than we're sure on any given day in our classroom or agency who's going to walk in the door. We work from and with a variety of service agencies, from the education profession, therapy, counseling, from the medical profession, social work. We work more intensively and broadly with families as we've grown in the field of family life education. Family literacy programs sometimes bring families to us 3-4 days a week where we're working with both parents and children. And the same is true with some English language learning programs. And of course, we still work with families in classroom settings, sometimes with the children only coming to the classroom, and we're trying to stay in communication with parents. In Minnesota, we frequently have parents with us in the classroom through the Early Childhood Family Education Program, and that's given us a lot of work with parent-child interaction opportunities. And I know there are other programs around the country that do that in other ways. There are, in addition to the diverse context in which we work with families, as our profession has grown, another reason to attend to ethical thinking and practice is the recognition that our work can make a difference. The field has grown past this age of innocence where you just felt like, oh gosh, I can help the family with information. We need to go beyond that and be aware of how we respond to perhaps harmful parenting practices that we observe. How do we respond to negative remarks about other family members from one family member? How do we share information about a family with a professional in another agency? What do we have set up for data privacy? Because we do have a risk of unintended consequences that can come from our actions. One of the first ways I realized this risk was I was enthusiastically sharing information with parents in my class only to have them return with arguments or rebukes from other family members when the information shared did not fit with their experience, belief, or culture. And there are other examples I'm sure that you have, and I could go on as well, but we'll have a chance to discuss that a little more, because when we consider ethical considerations, we need to figure out what can we do that will cause the least harm or preferably no harm. We also work on our own and without frequent supervision available. This happens in the classroom, even if we're on teaching teams. We may get some support, but oftentimes we're working on our own or with a non-licensed but valued assistant. We work in the office on our own with families. We see them alone on home visits, deal with them alone on the phone. Where do we get support from our colleagues in our work? We need to look for that support. And ethics work is a way to find it. We also collaborate outside of the family life education profession. We collaborate with others of varying professional preparation and experience. We need to educate those other professionals about our work and learn about theirs. They need to know our boundaries and priorities, and we need to share our expertise with them. I had a wonderful social work experience in a medical setting where we were on a committee to assess child development issues, and it was wonderful to learn from doctors and occupational therapists and other social workers and speech and language therapists their roles and work with families. At Minneapolis Children's Medical Center, a parent warm line was established with the support of doctors who saw a need for family educators to provide developmental and behavioral information. So learning to work with other professions is very helpful. Even in the legal field, I know there are many excellent curriculums out there being used that bring divorce education and parenting education to couples in custody battles and related family legal matters. And finally, as Dr. Glenn Palm of St. Cloud State University reminds us in one of his most recent articles on ethics and family education, I believe this article is in the NCFR booklet, by the way, and it is quoted frequently throughout this PowerPoint and throughout the MCFR booklet. Dr. Palm teaches us and recommends to us that ethics is a habit, a deeply ingrained way of thinking that permeates our interaction with family members and other professionals. It helps us to become moral and effective professionals. So how can we develop this deeply ingrained way of thinking? How can we become moral and effective professionals? To address these challenges, Minnesota Council on Family Relations about 20 years ago asked what would we need? What would we need to show how we can clarify the boundaries and scope of our work? The original ethics committee members are credited in the MCFR booklet. We have two of them in the room here today. Beth Gausman and Don Cassidy are with us, and who worked on developing principles and practices that we're going to be going over today. This ethics committee formed on their own, and the board has maintained an ethics committee ever since. They worked to get information from academicians and practitioners in the field about ethical situations. They surveyed practitioners. They often met on back porches and began by exploring the questions: what principles apply? What practices are important to the field and work of family life educators? We did a review of literature, and after all these meetings, consultations, studies, and discussions, we did more consultation and review through workshops in the mid-90s, through reviewing the principles put forth by other fields. The NAEYC list of principles was very influential. We also asked current professionals about their experience and gathered information about ethical situations practitioners were confronting in their work. With feedback from the workshops, they were able to refine and develop the principles and process that we're reviewing today. And they learned from this process the importance of collaborative collegial work in developing ethical thinking and practices and in using this process. After those early workshops, the booklet was published. There it is. And there was a first version. This is the second version of the booklet. And we collaborated with NCFR so that the ethical principles and practices became part of the CFLE certification process. Input from additional presentations led to a revised edition of the book, which we hope you are using today. And of course, we're continuing to present and experiment with new methods such as today's webinar for sharing information. Your feedback is going to be very important to us today, because every time we hear of situations and questions from attendees at our workshops, our learning about ethical thinking and practice grows. The stories, situations, issues, concerns, and questions that have come from past workshop participants led us to distinguish between challenging situations that have ethical implications and were uncomfortable and situations that were true ethical dilemmas. How do we determine what constitutes a true ethical dilemma? What do we need to think about in situations such as these that have ethical implications? See if any of these situations sound familiar to you. A divorcing parent tells you the other parent is not allowed to pick up their child from school. A parent shares with you that his or her partner uses harsh punishment techniques with their 3-year-old. A member of your class frequently criticizes the other parents for being too lenient with their children. In each of these cases, the family life educator wonders how to respond professionally. How could he or she decide what to do? I imagine you may have had some similar experiences. So we invite you now, as we do our workshop participants, to just think about one of those experiences. Think of an experience with an incident where you struggled with deciding the right or wrong professional action. Whether you write this experience down right now or mentally make a note of it to yourself doesn't matter. Just remember, what was the situation? Who was involved? And what were the major concerns you had? We hope to refer you back to this incident later when we review the case study analysis process. When we're dealing with situations with ethical implications, here are some of the first steps to take when thinking about them. What are the relationships involved? Who am I dealing with here? Do I know the history of these relationships? What is the quality and stage of my relationship with the family? And is this happening because I'm new to the program, or because the parent, or is it happening because the parent's known me for a long time and just now feels free to bring up this issue? As a practitioner in family life education, do I have the skills and experience I need to address this situation? Have I handled anything similar to this? What has and has not worked in the past? What have I tried? And finally, you want to consider what resources are available. Who else can I consult with? What other resources do I need, and how can I find them? Many difficult situations may simply be resolved by assessing these good basic practice issues. However, when you assess your level of experience and your resources and skills, when you assess the relationships and you find out that that is not enough, that you're still uncomfortable, there isn't a clear action to take, that's when you might be facing an ethical dilemma, because an ethical dilemma takes us beyond issues of experience, resources, and skills. A skillful practice might be something like dealing with a parent who dominates in group discussion. Addressing that issue is not an ethical dilemma. It's a matter of practice and skill. Dilemmas involve more than issues related to practice or experience. When you might be facing a dilemma, the next step is a review of the guiding principles developed by the MCFR Ethics Committee, thanks to the feedback of prior workshop participants. What we'd like to ask you to do now, I'm going to leave this slide up as I ask you to either open your booklet to page 7 in the MCFR booklet or page 14 in the NCFR booklet, or pull out your handout if you downloaded and printed it up on Principles, the Ethical Principles for Parent and Family Life Educators handout. There are 4 sections to these guiding principles. Each section is based on a set of relationships a family educator can expect to have as a professional. Note that the format is written as a commitment to action. We will act to do something. Sometimes I think of these principles as our professional promises to ourselves, our colleagues, community and society, parents and families and children. I'm going to ask you now to look at the page and look at the first category. Category 1 is relationships with parents and families. And we're not going to read through all of these. You can read through all of these. What I want to do is highlight those action words, highlight those promises, we're making. We'll be aware of the impact we have. Number 2, we'll strive to understand. Respect comes in both 3 and 5, with respecting cultural beliefs and respecting and accepting parents for who they are. 7 and 8 promises a level of skill of communication. We'll communicate respectfully. We'll communicate openly and truthfully. Number 11 brings up the idea of being proactive. We will be proactive in stating child guidance principles and discipline guidelines. 15 and 16 highlight the issues of support. We'll support family members as they make decisions. We'll support healthy interpersonal relationships. There are a lot of action words in these categories, lots of promises that we're making. In category 2, for children, it takes a slightly different tact if you look at those 6 principles in our relationship with children and youth. Once again, respect and understanding and sensitivity is mentioned. But there's also a promise to do no harm to children and youth and insist on the same from others. In number 4, we promise to advocate for children and youth and their best interests at the same time as working with the parents and family members that they're involved with. And we're supporting the right of all children to access quality education, health, and community resources. In category 3, our relationships with colleagues in the professions, we're providing staff with policies and support systems. We're following data privacy, and then number 4, we're following the mandatory reporting. We're also defining our role and recognizing the difference between personal and professional values. And lastly, in our relationships with community and society are the action words of becoming knowledgeable, awareness of boundaries, communicating clearly, and cooperating. And numbers 4 and 5 are 2 that we might talk about a little bit later because it's to advocate for laws and policies that reflect our changing knowledge and reflect the best interests of parents, family, and community. As well as number 5 says we will respect and uphold laws and regulations that pertain to our practice as parent and family life educators and offer expertise to authorities. When we talk about the potential later of conflict and contradiction and tension, that in our own profession, our commitment to families and to community and society, there's a lot of issues and contradictions going on now, and we hear it a lot on the political scene. So that is certainly an area that merits discussions related to ethical dilemmas. There's similarities between the principles and actions required of professionals, and the awareness of that potential for conflict is part of defining an ethical dilemma. When we have a dilemma and conflicting principles are identified, then we're going to be faced with choice and compromise. We'll work with these principles more in depth during the case study analysis process, but we wanted to introduce them to you now as we talk about the difference between ethical situations and dilemmas. We'll explore this process further after Bill reviews a variety of approaches to ethics and how we integrated the strengths of those approaches to come up with this process.
Thanks, Mary. And, in thinking about historical approaches to ethics, there have been 2 camps or 2 approaches that we think about or that we see that folks have taken. One is an absolutist approach, and the other is this relativist approach. And we're going to spend a little time talking about each of these. In the absolutist camp or approach, folks have tried to find the absolute truths that apply in all situations. There's a tendency to think, well, once we discover these truths, then there's no need for further discussion. And in that sense, if taken to the ultimate extreme, this approach can be kind of dogmatic. On the other hand, or at the other end of the spectrum, there are the relativists who see the world quite differently. They emphasize situational ethics, that contexts really determine what's right and what needs to be done in a specific situation. But again, taken to its extreme, we're left with the impression that truth and morality are simply a matter of opinion. Now, more recently, approaches to ethical thinking have attempted to combine both the static aspects of ethics that is the need for codes of conduct or standards, with more dynamic factors such as individual aspiration or societal customs and how those change over time. The model that we're presenting today actually is an integration of three important approaches to ethics: virtues, principles, and relational or relationships. And we're going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail now. Let's start with virtues. This aspect or component of our model focuses on internal factors, things like who we are versus what we do or how we do it, about personal characteristics, things like our personal dispositions to do the right thing, and the characteristics that we bring to the work that we do. Now, some of those characteristics might be thought of as general or core virtues, things like dedication to fairness and justice, honesty and clarity in our work, transparency, but also things like courage. Sometimes you don't hear that word associated with our work with families, but you have to be pretty courageous to hang in there with folks that are sometimes stressed or overwhelmed. And so we see that as being another one of these core virtues. In addition, there are some profession-specific virtues, things that are really not unique to our line of work, but certainly essential parts of it. Things like altruism, wanting to help others and to care for others. Things like knowledge and wisdom about families and family process. And also the ability to instill certain things like hope and optimism in the people that we work with. Now next, we look at the principles approach, or principles component of our model. And that provides some guidance on what to do. That is, we might be asking questions about what action should we take in a certain situation. And the answers to those questions might suggest some we will or we won't statements, as Mary was saying, that can be guides to our ethical actions. But none of this occurs in a vacuum. And we never have to think that we have to carry the decision-making and all this work on our own. Even if we're working in a private practice office or with a class by ourselves, we also always have to be thinking about how can we collaborate with other professionals and with our colleagues to determine these principles. It's through the discussion and consensus about these that we actually understand ethics. And I think that that's what Professor Glenn Palm was saying in this, another quotation from the article, seminal article that Mary mentioned earlier. Now, the third aspect of our model centers on relationships. And as you've already seen, we are interested in lots of kinds of relationships that are important to ethical decision-making. Relationships with parents and families, children and youth, our colleagues, and of course, society as a whole. So the relational ethics component is centered around this idea of caring, understanding relationships. That's kind of the beginning and also the end goal of this relational ethics approach. We also are thinking about the fact that it's our responsibility as the practitioners and as the educators to maintain and nurture these caring, understanding relationships. And to do this, we have to identify many different relationships and types of relationships that affect the families and kids that come to us. That's a family systems or systemic idea. We also want to assess where we are in the relationship process with them and where they are with the people that matter in their lives. That's a developmental idea. And finally, we want to prioritize which are the primary relationships through which our work may be focusing, and also the primary relationships that can actually facilitate the work that we're trying to do. All along, we have to continue to build trust, to recognize and maybe even overcome some barriers, and observe the appropriate boundaries between ourselves and the work that we do and what we're capable of doing. This kind of harkens back to what Mary was saying about knowing our limitations as practitioners or educators in any situation. That's an ethical consideration. So to summarize, this relational aspect of the model really requires us to understand the relationship process, but also to accept professional responsibility for making this process happen. We're the drivers of this process. And to take that road analogy maybe a little bit further, we're actually looking at three different components. The virtues component is kind of like the energy or the fuel that is our motivation for being ethical, whereas the principles that we come up with are guideposts or maybe the guide rails along the road to make sure that we stay on the pavement. And finally, that relational ethics focus tells us where we are in the process, what additional roads or relationships we might want to explore to be able to do more ethical practice with the people that come to us. This integrative model helps resolve some of the inherent tension and maybe even contradictions between that absolutist model that we talked about before and the relativist model. That is, that it has components that are both static but also dynamic. Another way to look at this would be that it provides some balance across generations by helping us to see the virtues and sort of endearing qualities that people have to be good at this work, but also the current context that families bring to us, and it helps us to have a dynamic ability to anticipate the kinds of changes in family structure or the kinds of influences that might impinge on families like technology and other things. Families are changing, and our approach to ethics has to change and evolve along with them. And again, I think that's what Professor Palm is saying here, that ethics is an alive and evolving process, and we're hoping that this model will provide a way of being able to cope with that evolution as you work with families. Keep in mind that if you've got questions about this, I know we're kind of sort of flowing through it fairly quickly, that you jot those down, maybe even send them in electronically, and we'll address as many of those as we can as we get to the end of the presentation. And with that, maybe we're ready to start looking at some of these principles in a little bit more detail, Mary, and maybe even doing a case example.
I think that's exactly where we're at. I need to remind people once again, keep those handouts and the booklets in front of you because we're going to be using them again now as we revisit, or as we use the ethical principles to apply to a case study analysis of an ethical dilemma. You will also need to make sure you have your case study analysis process steps handout with you. The case study example that we're using today is on that handout. It's titled Practice Case Study, Mother, Daughter, Father Dilemma. I'm going to give you just a second to organize your booklet and your handouts.
It's an intriguing title.
Mother, Daughter, Father Dilemma. I don't know who titled these. We'd have to ask the folks that came. They wanted, of course, to give it very objective titles. We're not trying to lead you in any one particular direction with this. In the first step, before we go through the case study, the first step in the process, in the analysis process, is the first of 5 steps. The first is to identify the relationships. So that's what we're going to do when we read through the case study in just a minute. Second, we're going to be identifying the principles that are relevant to this case study. Then we look at, are there contradictions and tensions between those principles? And when there are contradictions and tensions, remember that is your hallmark for knowing that you are dealing with a dilemma. You are going to have a tough choice to make. After that reflection and information gathering, then and only then do we identify possible solutions. Now, our challenge today is to try to illustrate this case study analysis process for you without the benefit of the 60 to 90-minute small group sessions that are so valued at our face-to-face workshops. So please use your imagination along with your intellect as we journey through this overview and simulation of the process. We're sort of a cyber group, but as you know, you've got to type in your questions, and we aren't addressing them to the end. So we're just going to do, what we're going to do is bring in responses from past groups to help provide a sense of the work and ideas that come from collaborating. The process is meant to be done in dialogue with colleagues. So the first step identifies the relationships involved, and we usually do that as a large group in the workshop. Let's take a look now. You know what, let me just read the case study now, and then we'll look at the steps involved. And as I'm reading the case study, jot down what relationships are you identifying in this situation. So as we go through this together, you're going to be jotting down the relationships that you're noting. In one mother-child pair in your class for toddlers and their parents, the toddler has several developmental delays, and the mother has some too. The mother alludes to the father being abusive. In talking with others who deal with the mom, you have been made aware of the dominance of the father and his family. How can you support the mom and daughter without causing upset in the family relationships? You have been told that the father will pull the family from any support if he feels threatened. What does the good family educator do? As you're looking at that and identifying the relationships, you're trying to identify all the pertinent relationships to this situation.
You know, Mary, from your description, some of them may be obvious, but some of them are actually implicit, and you have to think a little bit about them, think about the story and the narrative to actually make them explicit.
And that's why we included the story and the narrative on your case study analysis process steps, so that you can kind of refer to it as you jot down the relationships. Here are some of the initial ones that come up in the large groups that at the workshops. Right? Everyone's got mother-daughter, mother-father, mother-teacher, mother and daughter in the class, the mother-daughter, father, and the father's family. And I bet you've got some other ideas, too.
You know, Mary, where's our relationship with the mother?
Well,
I mean, that's an example of an
example.
Implicit relationship that sometimes folks don't think about.
And what about those others you've heard things from about the family? Who are those folks? That's certainly true.
And how reliable are they?
And how reliable are they? Are they other professionals in the field, or are they other parents in your class?
Sure.
Who are these others that you're hearing from? Well, let's look at the broader relational field. Do you have all of these groupings?
Ah, there you go. Sure.
I see a few of them.
Teacher, family. Sure.
Yeah, developmental delays were involved. So could there possibly be some social services going on there with the parent connection? Is the family already linked to early childhood special education and early intervention? The other thing to ask when you're looking at the relational field, now that you've kind of listed as many as you possibly can, is to kind of look at, well, what are the primary caring relationships that you want to focus on? Often those are the first that come to mind. So what we had on that first slide is usually where you find your primary caring relationship. What might you identify here, Bill, as the primary caring relationships we should focus on?
Well, certainly the parents and their daughter, the mother and father and their daughter, but also the relationship between the mother and the father that we might want to be aware of. How's that relationship going? And
right.
Is that likely to get in our way or actually facilitate maybe the work that we're doing? So that'd be an important one, I think.
Part of what happens when you identify all the relationships involved is you realize all the questions you still need to ask about those relationships. You realize what we don't know. You know, are these folks new to class? Have they been with us for a semester or a year? Are they new to the country? What's their history?
Right.
What's our history with them? So all knowing the relationships helps us to identify the primary relationships, what resources we might need, and what questions we may need to ask. Let's see. If we've identified the primary relationships, and if we've identified what we know about the relationships, then we're ready to take that case study and try to identify all the principles that may apply. And here in small groups, first alone, actually, we have folks do this on their own, reading the principles and circling the ones you think apply. And then in small groups in the workshop, they actually kind of merge the ones that they have figured out. So at your next meeting or in your next class, you might want to have your participants read through the principles. But today, we're just going to have to once again bring in principles that were mentioned at our last, one of our last workshops.
This step tends to take a little bit of time, right, Mary?
It does. Technically, you are in small group. The first time you do this and the first time you're used to going through the principles, it takes anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes.
Okay.
A lot of times, depending on how much debate there is in the small groups over which principles apply, because you always, some folks like to, depending on the perspective you're coming from, you're going to think of, you might be more likely to think of some principles over others. But the principles are not meant to be hierarchical in any way, shape, or form. We're not meant to have the principles regarding relationships with children be of higher value than the principles with parents and families.
Okay.
Each category is important. Each principle is equally valid. They are all to be honored. What we're looking to do here is kind of figure out which ones apply to the relationships in the situation and are relevant to guiding our ethical actions. So here's a sample of the principles reported by a small group at a face-to-face workshop. In Category 1, the small groups agreed that under Category 1, Principles 3, 5, 9, and 16 were all valid and relevant in this situation. Those would include the ones about respecting cultural beliefs, backgrounds, and differences, and engaging in practices that are sensitive to the diversity of child-rearing values and goals. They agreed that respecting and accepting parents and other family members for who they are, recognizing their developmental level and circumstance was a relevant principle. And then number 9 is supporting diverse family values and examining alternative parenting practices as whether or not they support healthy relationships. And finally, 16, supporting healthy interpersonal relationships among all family members was kind of one that came up in all the groups.
I like that one, 16, because what it suggests is even though it's been reported that dad, might be coercive or might, pull the family from our work, that we have to believe that he wants a good relationship with his child and obviously with his wife as well. So.
Right, and we don't know, one of the things we need to learn, we might know if we were actually involved in the case study, where we were in our relationship with that family. But right now we're without all the information that we would want to have.
Sure.
In terms of Category 2, our relationships with children, 3 principles were most commonly identified. Principle number 2 was striving to understand children and youth in the context of their families. Number 3, doing no harm to children and youth and insisting on the same from others. And number 4, advocating for children and youth in their best interest at the same time that we work with parents and their families. So those are the principles that the group came up with. You may note others. Remember, we're giving you a representation of the ones. I guess I'll tell you right now, these are the ones that the groups identified as the most relevant, because that's the next part of the next step. So,
but I can see why this takes a bit of time, Mary, that, to actually go through this process with all 4 of those relational categories. This takes a little bit of thought and maybe dialogue with our colleagues.
And this is why we want to emphasize that it's a process, and it's important to do it with your colleagues, because first you do it alone. Which principles seem applicable to you? Then you compare with the small groups, and you go, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that one, or this one jumped out at me, and I skipped that one. Because until you become familiar with the principles, it does take a little bit longer. And sharing, of course, just brings the discussion forward to figuring out which principles are actually going to guide your actions. These are the principles that came up in Category 3, providing staff with policies and support systems for addressing difficult situations, and following the mandatory reporting in case that allusion to the abusive father might, what does abusive mean? Yeah, we don't know. That's something certainly worth exploring. And finally, for this family and the needs identified in the case study, principles in regard to community and society are not being knowledgeable about community resources, and finding ways to communicate clearly and cooperate with other programs and agencies in order to best serve those and best meet those family needs. So that, I hope, gives you a little bit of an overview of how you would take a case study, identify the relational field and the status of the relationships and what you do and don't know about the different relationships. Emphasizing the primary relationships, look at the principles and which principles apply to that case study, which principles are most likely to guide your actions. I already gave it away, which principles are most relevant. The samples that we showed you on those past slides, and I forgot to suggest to you, as I meant to, that you might want to circle those on your sheets. Perhaps some of you did. I am going to give you the opportunity. I'm going to go back and let you see those slides again so that you can circle those principles. My apologies for not suggesting that you do that. So as you're looking at the principles for Category 1, if you would please circle number 3, 5, 9, and 16. For Category 2, please circle numbers 2, 3, and 4. Category 3, please circle numbers 2 and 4. And finally, circle 1 and 3 for Category 4. Thank you. The ones you've circled, for our purposes today, those are the principles that are the most relevant to this case study. If you were discussing this with another group of colleagues, you might come up with some of those and a few different ones. But from the examples from the last workshop we did, these are the ones we're going to use now to move on to step 3. Here's where we look for the contradictions or for tensions between the principles. So using those principles that you've circled now, we're going to look at what connections have been made, what tensions or contradictions have been identified between them. This is what's going to identify the situation as an ethical dilemma with any difficult situation you review using this process. So take a minute now, look at those relevant principles you've circled, and if you see some contradiction or tension, draw a line between them. In the next slide, you're going to have an opportunity to see the contradictions or tensions that were identified by our workshop participants. Category 1, Principle 5, and Category 2, Principle 4, were seen as exhibiting some tension or contradiction for this case study. Respecting and accepting the parents for who they are, and yet trying to advocate for their children and youth while working with the parents and other family members, depending on what your relationships were, what the outcome of the abuse of the accusation was. All those, there was tension identified between those two principles. So we probably definitely do have a dilemma here. And debate and discussion usually ensue about how much, how do we weigh the levels of contradiction or tension between the principles. But that all helps us to prioritize our focus. There was also contradiction between Category 1, respecting and accepting the parents for who they are, recognizing their developmental level and circumstances, and Principle 16, supporting healthy interpersonal relationships. There's oftentimes discussion, Bill, I go, well, that's not really in conflict because, if we're supporting healthy interpersonal relationships, we'll change who they are. But if you're recognizing folks for their developmental level and their circumstances, still you need to find a way to build on strength, and it can be, it's just a challenging situation.
And some of this contradiction and tension is also about tension between our own cultural background, or maybe even things like other demographic factors like our country of origin or religion, that those tend to influence the way we see some of these conflicts as well. It doesn't necessarily determine them, but I think it's part of the mix, and we have to sort of take those into account.
And I think I put in number one, category 1, 9 here to sort of reflect that we will support diverse family values. However, we still have to advocate for children and we still have to support healthy interpersonal relationships. So you can have conflict and tension between more than 2 principles. You can have it between 3. You can have it between 4. And with every workshop, we can sometimes get a little different emphasis between the principles. But what they do is prepare us for that next step of looking for possible solutions. The first 3 steps are the ones that give us the background information that we need to guide our actions. We don't consider actions until step 4.
I think that's a really important point to make, that this is where people sometimes start. They start by thinking, well, what could we do? And then let's just do something. And what this is showing you is that there are some major steps we have to do before we can even get to the point of brainstorming.
Absolutely. So the question here really is, in light of what we now know from our first 3 steps, our review of the relationships involved, our review of the relevant and contradictory principles, then what actions do you suggest? And this is where it really helps to have your colleagues and your peers with you, because you usually can come up with some, but by golly, another set of eyes on a situation, evaluating information from you really helps to serve your profession and your families that you work with.
It's a collegial process.
Very much so. Very much so. And what were some solutions that they came up with? Possible. It's not always a solution, by the way. I don't mean to imply that, hey, we can solve this dilemma. You usually can't. A dilemma by nature means that there's going to be a conflict, a compromise, a choice to make. But you can take action, and you can come up with possible actions.
And those actions can make things better. They may not solve them, but they may improve the situation and empower people.
Absolutely. And you can see most of these suggestions focus on relationship building, more data gathering, and some resource identification and referral. And your options are not limited to this list. We're just giving you an example of, gosh, at the workshops, we develop lists. And these were the ones from the last one that we did. We might, let's see. We might also then, from that list, you generate your list of actions, then you have to select the one. And you try to select the one that reflects the best adherence to the relevant principles. The nature of it being an ethical dilemma means that you're probably going to compromise one of your principles, but the principles can guide you and they provide support for your action. You can say as a professional, I am doing this because I am adhering to these principles and I recognize that I'm compromising this one in hopes of a better outcome for the family.
And what I like about this sequencing, Mary, is that since you have brainstormed more than one possible solution, you have some backup. If the first thing that you do or the first thing that's suggested that you try doesn't work, you've got sort of a bullpen to go back to and say, well, let's try this. This might work a little bit better to reduce some of the conflict inherent in this situation.
Absolutely. Thanks for mentioning that, Bill. I want to make you aware that after the webinar, we hope that you'll take time to think back to the situation where you experienced some professional angst about what was right or wrong action to take, and consider using your example and sharing this process with colleagues to address the ethical issues that your own example presents. You can follow the case study analysis steps, and remember, if you don't find a contradiction or tension between principles at step 3, then it's not a dilemma, but still a challenging situation that requires reflection on the relationships, principles, skills, experience, and resources needed to address it, all of which is helpful to do with colleagues. If you find a contradiction, then you can analyze those principles and identify where those tensions are and figure out how they can guide you through choosing an action to take. And reviewing that action, as Bill said, to select from something else from the menu. In your booklets, there are additional case studies. 2 more involve classroom dilemmas, one involving special education services and one a cultural dilemma. So there are dilemmas for you to follow up on at your next class meeting for those of you that are in class, or at your next staff meeting, or at your next lunch with a colleague. if you want to share this information. There's also one about a marriage preparation class situation with gay couples, which is certainly a hot topic.
Topical here.
Very topical here in Minnesota right now. And the last, there's one more in there that I'm not, a custody. It's a parenting custody issue that you might find useful. So those are some ways to use the case study analysis process, and I think, Bill, you've got a few more ways for them to
Sure. Consider. In thinking about how we might make this model come alive in our work, we might want to start with the way that we train folks, whether that be at the undergraduate or graduate level. If we are thinking about and giving folks a way, an organized way or model of thinking about ethical thinking and process, that could be helpful. And in addition to that, those of us who've been out in the field for a while need to incorporate ethical thinking and decision-making in our continuing education plans and making sure that it's part of the language, part of our training. Agencies and departments at the state and local level may want to build in orientations that take into account an organized way of thinking about ethics and ethical decision-making. And in that way, they can promote awareness and hopefully improving ethical standards. I think even right down to the individual staff meeting level, that is, if we are talking about ethics and talking about ethical standards as we talk about cases and clinical consultations, or as we discuss classroom situations in family and child life education, if we're doing that on a daily basis and weekly basis, then we make ethics come alive in a way that's more transparent and more deep than if we just do this once a year or do this one time in a training regime.
It is really nice, Bill. I will have to say, after I was involved for the first time in attending those workshops in the mid-'90s, and it's really nice to have, I think, a little problem-solving process available to you when you're dealing with those challenging situations. You have a way to think about it, and that's why using it regularly is just so helpful. It keeps it fresh in your mind.
I think that's the key. I mean, I do a lot of teaching, and I think a lot of us here do a lot of teaching around cultural competence. And I think it's an analogous situation to that if the only time culture and diversity ever come up is in the 90-minute, lecture or workshop once a year, it's not going to get into the life of the organization. It's the same with this discussion of ethics, that it has to be an ongoing process of improvement and illumination. As far as what are some things that are obstacles or challenges to making ethics come alive in the work that we do, we came up with at least 3 things. One is this business of distinguishing between true ethical dilemmas and more standard practice problems. And you talked about that earlier in the presentation, and hopefully all of you as participants now have a better sense of how to make that distinction. Also, there are, as everyone knows, changes in the models of service delivery that we use, as well as changes to families themselves in forms of family structure, etc. And these can sometimes present or exacerbate possible ethical boundaries or ethical dilemmas. And so we have to be aware of those, that these changes in family structure and changes in funding models can sometimes force us into doing things that may not be as ethical as we would hope. And then finally, as far as convincing our leadership and our senior management in departments and at agencies, we have to be sure that they're leading the charge in saying that ethics matter and saying that they will devote the time, the resources, and the personal capital to make sure that these issues are inculcated in everything that we do. In that sense, I think this summary quote from Glenn Palm's article really addresses this business of continuing this ongoing process of consensus and collaboration among colleagues.
Yeah, we really hope that the ideas presented today, the integration of the 3 approaches to ethics in combination with the list of the principles, the categories of the principles, and the case study analysis process give you some additional insight for addressing the challenging situations and ethical dilemmas in family life education. you will have a chance to give some input to today's presentation, and we are going to have an opportunity to answer some questions, I believe, next.
Definitely.
Yes. There are two questions that have come in, and I think some of this has been covered already, but I also believe that reiterating some of these finer points is important. The first question that came in acknowledges that many staff meetings tend to be a complaint session about families within the program, rather than this more respectful approach to serving families. What suggestions do you have for encouraging coworkers to embrace this more respectful manner of approaching dilemmas with families? We don't have, I'm guessing the person writing in doesn't have the background yet in ethical practice.
You know, becoming acquainted with the principles is something that gives you a standard to which you're aspiring. Remember, those principles are our guideposts, and they help us, and they emphasize healthy, building relationships. So part of what you want to do with families, and what's healthier for you as a family life educator, is to be able to look at a family's strengths and identify them, and to see progress, even if you're finding only one strength and 10 challenges, and one baby step of progress and 3 backward steps in other areas. It's difficult. I think that gets back to also drawing on your virtues, your inner strength, why you're in that, where's your hope and optimism in working with families. But becoming familiar with the principles. I was even going to suggest something as simple as reviewing 1 or 2 principles at each meeting, and there may be some relevance to the despair that sometimes folks feel in their work with families. You have to be able to find that inner energy of hope and optimism, and you have to be able to find the support for staff to feel in dealing with families. I'm not sure if that's a practical suggestion.
Well, I think it gets back to what we said about fuel. I mean, and motivation. That these virtues, as you said, so well, Mary, that they really are the thing that fuel us and keep us hopeful, keep us helpful when working with that kind of demoralizing sense of problems. Here's another problem, or here's another problem family, or another problem child. And that if we go back to those personal characteristics that we talked about before, courage, wisdom, prudence, that those are the things that will sort of take us through the situation and turn our conversation about families from complaints and a list of problems to what are the resources available to this family? What are their strengths? What are the things that we're going to build on to be able to address the problems?
Yeah. Because it sounds like you're stuck, and you got to get unstuck.
Right, and simply this process lifts us to a higher level of professionalism naturally, and I feel like that is the struggle with this participant in this question, is recognize that and the desire for a higher level of professionalism. Yeah. Okay, another question has come in, and although I think that this is a logistics question, I think it bears repeating. Where are the additional case studies found?
Oh, yes, the additional case studies are found in either the NCFR or the MCFR booklet. They are in both. In the NCFR booklet, it will actually walk you through a case study analysis process, once again, with a cultural clash in the classroom, so that you'll have that guide. But the case study analysis process is also described in the MCFR booklet. And both booklets have about 4 or 5 additional case studies to the one we reviewed today.
Another question is asked, and this participant says, it seems to me that most of the ethical situations are implications rather than dilemmas. Do you find this to be true?
I think they're both. And I think that's what makes this a little bit challenging, that there are implications, ethical implications, in most of what we do in human service. But there are also some dilemmas where there are some things that are in tension that seem unsolvable or seem unanswerable. And it's the intensity of the tension, the intensity of the conflict that makes them true dilemmas.
I think what we wanted to do was not diminish the challenging situations, the situations with ethical implications. They may not be dilemmas. However, there's still challenges to our practice. And there are ways, and this came out of discussion of during the last 3 years of presenting workshops. After our second booklet was published, we went out and we were doing workshops and updates again with folks across Minnesota and at the NCFR conference, I think, a few years ago. And we got feedback saying, well, what about my situations that aren't ethical dilemmas? Well, it doesn't mean you can't do anything. Those first couple steps are really important, of evaluating practitioner skill, evaluating the resources available to you, and evaluating the relationships. That relational, exploring the relational field and knowing that you as a professional, as Bill said, drive the relationship.
Right.
You're the one responsible. Just as we so often try to work with parents and reminding them that you're the one responsible for how you react to your child.
But it's our example,
It's our example. Yes, it is.
Allows us to provide that example.
It is.
I think in an effort to share, ask a question here in response to helping our coworkers assume this more professional posture, somebody has written in and asked if this PowerPoint will be available again after the webinar. And I do believe that's true, that the NCFR website will be providing
The webinar.
It won't be, okay, it will not be the PowerPoint per se, but it will be the recording of this webinar. Okay.
Right, the webinar will be on, the PowerPoint is not, the PowerPoint information is in your materials. It is in the booklets. The MCFR one is free, and you can download that from the website, or you can order copies of either booklet. And the NCFR one has the whole article by Glenn, the entire article by Glenn Palm in it. So they're both valuable booklets, and as I said, it can be downloaded. So the materials are in there. The principles, the case study analysis process are all there. The PowerPoint, however, changes with the presentation and the audience. This is a webinar format. We have a workshop format PowerPoint, and we're going to be looking and asking for feedback from participants on what kind of follow-up to today's session would you like, because we would love the opportunity to practice something with a smaller group of folks as a follow-up, whether it's a go-to-meeting option or a conference call option. Or with technology today, it's great to meet you in person, come face-to-face, but maybe with technology we can come up with some options.
Right here, part of what you're saying, Mary, is that actually the transcript or listening to this webinar again, it will be an audio format, that listening to this webinar again with the booklet out, that will be your best guide rather than sort of looking at a PowerPoint and trying to flip through the slides that way. That would be a better way of being able to refresh your knowledge on this.
Yeah. The slides, I have a pretty much shorthand version of the book and your handouts, so please use those.
Mm-hmm. That is all the questions I have on this side.
Very good.
So we can advance on.
Well, it's been a pleasure, as usual, doing it. It's always fun to have the questions.
Yeah, I think we have some closing tasks, though, to do. Yeah, the questions are great.
Closing tasks. If you have time immediately after this webinar, we would appreciate your feedback through a brief survey. If you do not have time, an email will be sent 1 hour after this presentation with a link to the survey. Additionally, this webinar has been approved for CFLE credit at 1 contact hour. If you would like a generic completion certificate to acknowledge your time, please contact Don Cassidy at the address you see on your screen. Give you a moment to record that. And then for additional information on this workshop content or presenter availability, please contact Mary Maher or Linda Bukalich, at this address on your screen. All right, and that concludes our webinar. Thank you very much for your attendance, and thanks to Bill and Mary as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.